This story happened to one of you subscribers. Write any 8-letter word in the comments if you've ever felt like you saw or heard something unexplainable. Even now, after lengthy rehabilitation, forever maimed, traumatized, and incapable of leading a normal life due to mental afflictions, I recall with regret that moment I accepted the strange pizza delivery order that set off the whole horrid event. It was peculiar because of the address. There was no alley or building number like that on any map. I paid it no mind as Barcelona is an ancient city, and it seemed plausible that an alleyway could easily be hidden, simply omitted from the map. But as soon as I turned into it in the Raval district, an unpleasant sensation immediately washed over me. It was an unusually quiet street, far too silent for that area, and the silence itself felt unnatural. Not a single sound. No mopeds, no people, no birds. It made me feel as if the entire world had suddenly frozen. I glanced at the windows around me, yet all of them were either empty, darkened, bricked over, or boarded up. There wasn't the slightest hint of life anywhere, only a tight labyrinth of old shabby buildings, looming eerily over the narrow alley. My gaze involuntarily drifted to the building across the way, a pizzeria, its neon sign flickering, casting a reddish glow onto the pavement. Why didn't they order from there, I thought, as it was literally just steps away. I looked closer. Everything inside the pizzeria appeared pristine. Clean tables, neatly arranged chairs, lamps glowing on each one. It should have been a lively place, buzzing with laughter, conversations, the clinking of dishes. But an absolute silence reigned. Not a single customer, not a single waiter. There wasn't even a cook visible behind the counter. Everything looked as if life had disappeared from it just seconds ago, leaving only this alluring scent hanging in the air, like a ghost. Suddenly, I noticed a car parked by the curb in front of the building. It was running. The engine hummed. Headlights were on, but there was no driver. I walked closer, inspecting the cabin carefully. It was empty. The motor continued to hum, yet there wasn't a trace of anyone who might have left the car in such a state. Something was clearly amiss. Was this a prank? But I didn't see a single sign that this could be a joke. This only intensified my sense of unease. Perhaps I should have turned back and left as quickly as possible, but I was obliged to complete the delivery. I took a deep breath and headed toward the building, clutching the pizza box. My boots barely made any sound against the pavement, which for some reason only unnerved me further. I glanced again at the car, expecting something to happen, that the engine would shut off, or at least that the driver would return. But everything remained the same. The silence pressed in from all sides. No children, no people. All the windows in the building were darkened, as if every resident had decided at once to hide in darkness. I swallowed, trying to gather my thoughts. Maybe everyone was at home. It could just be some local holiday I didn't know about, and everyone had gone out somewhere in the city. The building had neither a doorbell nor a knocker. Holding the pizza box, I cautiously opened the very tall entrance door. It emitted a prolonged creaky sound, as though it hadn't been oiled in ages. One step inside, and I was instantly struck by a sharp sensation. A mix of stale air that weighed heavily on my lungs and a strange scent, reminiscent of spices with a bitter undertone. The moment I inhaled it, my temples began to pulse. My head started spinning, as if something unseen was pressing on my mind from within. I even held my breath for a moment, trying not to inhale any more of this stench. The corridor greeted me with absolute darkness. The only thing barely illuminating the space was a few dim, grimy ceiling lights that flickered, as if each of them could burn out at any second. The light fell onto the peeling walls, covered in stains and cracks that resembled chaotic wrinkles on old skin. Every sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty space, as though the building absorbed them, leaving me alone with this oppressive silence. To the right of the entrance, I noticed an old sign listing the apartment numbers. Its metal casing was covered in rust, and the writing had long since faded, though some of it was still legible. The floor I needed was marked somewhere in the middle of the list, the third. There were two options, either the dark stairway that stretched into darkness or the nearby elevator, old and battered, its doors barely hanging on but still operational. I didn't want to brave those unwelcoming stairs, so the choice was clear. I took a step toward the elevator, pressed the call button, and within seconds heard the familiar hum of the mechanism. The elevator was approaching, though slowly, as if each movement costed tremendous effort. The elevator finally arrived, and its bell, loud and piercing, shattered the silence that reigned over the building. The sound made me flinch. It seemed too loud for this eerie place, as if it didn't belong here. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as the elevator doors began to open with a creaking noise, as though the old mechanism was on the verge of breaking. But then something strange happened. The doors abruptly stopped, as if something was blocking them. They shook, rattling with a metallic clatter, and froze, only half open. I felt an unpleasant sensation, as if someone or something was holding the doors from within. I stood still for a moment, staring into the narrow gap, expecting to see. I didn't even know what, but there was nothing. No movement. I swallowed nervously, exhaling in frustration, realizing I'd have to take the stairs. It seemed that even the simplest task in this building couldn't go without complications. So turning back, I headed for the staircase. It was spiral, narrow, and stretched upward into the darkness, where even the dim corridor light couldn't reach. The higher I climbed, the thicker the darkness seemed to grow. The wall lamps didn't work, or perhaps they'd never been installed. I had to steady myself with one hand on the wall, which was rough, covered in cracks and stains that scraped my hand. The surface was so uneven that my fingers slid over crumbling plaster, like old scars on the body of this building. Each step echoed in the emptiness, and in the narrow stairwell, it felt as if I wasn't alone. My legs were nearly trembling, not from physical exertion, but from the indescribable unease that grew with each step upward. I continued climbing, clutching the rough, nearly crumbling wall, when suddenly the light went out. Darkness engulfed me like a heavy blanket, squeezing my lungs. I froze, feeling tension penetrate every muscle. Around me, absolute silence, so intense that a ringing began in my ears. A breeze or draft couldn't explain this. It was something else. I tensed and held my breath, listening closely. It seemed that in the distance, somewhere deep in the darkness, something was slowly approaching. It wasn't walking, not moving swiftly, but rather advancing step by step, as if dragging darkness along with it. My hand nervously fumbled in my pocket for a flashlight, fingers slipping over the fabric, but my nerves made it difficult to find. Panic started seeping into my mind, filling it with buzzing and cold. What are those sounds, I thought, trying to locate the flashlight. The darkness around me was thick, almost tangible, and I barely held myself back from bolting down, back to the exit. But then suddenly something changed sharply. A noise. A door nearby burst open with a slam. I jerked to the side, heart pounding wildly as if trying to escape my chest. Light from the apartment sliced through the darkness of the landing, flooding it with a yellowish tint. I slowly turned my gaze to the doorway. A frail old man stood there, in a tank top and track pants, looking unkempt with wild, empty eyes. He just stood there, motionless, staring at me in silence. A shiver ran down my skin under his gaze. The light from the apartment was so harsh that I squinted, and even then I couldn't see anything but his face, which seemed to express nothing, only a silent void. He looked as though he was simply staring through me. I tried to explain that I was here with a delivery, that it was just a mistake or a strange coincidence, but he didn't react, didn't even budge. Feeling my breath growing heavier, I squeezed past him, barely brushing against his dirty tank top, and continued up. The light from the apartment faintly lit the stairs, helping me go further. When I reached the next floor, I saw the door of the apartment from which the order had come. The door looked old, with peeling paint, yet somehow, despite its dilapidation, it remained elegant and appeared expensive. So I knocked 3 times, feeling the smooth and firm texture of the aged wood, and waited. Just as hurried footsteps sounded behind the door, I heard a loud slam behind me. The old man had abruptly shut his door, as if in anger or haste, and once again everything was swallowed by complete darkness. The door before me slowly opened. A small girl, perhaps 9 or 10, appeared on the threshold. She was tiny, delicate, with enormous eyes that sparkled with joy. Her reaction unsettled me. She looked as if she'd been waiting for me her entire life. The joy on her face was so genuine that it felt as though I'd brought her not just pizza, but a Christmas gift. Her energy instantly filled the space, creating a surreal atmosphere. Somewhere in the apartment, old music played in the background, adding a strange contrast to her excitement. Just as I was about to hand her the pizza, she, with the irrepressible eagerness of a child, pulled me inside. It happened so quickly that I didn't have time to say anything. Her small hands were surprisingly strong, and within a moment I was already inside the apartment, leaving my shoes by the door. Almost bouncing with joy, she seized the pizza box and dashed deeper into the apartment. Her voice echoed down the long corridor as she gleefully announced the arrival of lunch to someone unseen. I stood, glancing around, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss. The apartment looked overly old-fashioned, as if it had never been renovated. Heavy curtains half covered the grimy windows, and faded photographs hung on the walls. Yet none of them showed faces. It was as if the images had been erased or worn away. The air in the apartment carried a scent of dust, the mustiness of old furniture, and I felt a faint dizziness wash over me. A question flickered in my mind. Why such joy? Why did this girl react to me as if I were a savior? Before disappearing into a room, the girl threw me a look and, pointing toward the living room, informed me that the payment awaited me there. She vanished behind the door, leaving me standing in the semi-darkness. The music continued to play in the background, its melody growing stranger with each note. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, as though there was someone or something else in the apartment, unseen and restless. I had to follow her. Her light footsteps, the sound of her shoes hitting the hollow floor, echoed down the spacious corridor. When I stepped into the living room, a strange sensation washed over me. The interior was far cozier than one would expect from such a gloomy building. The small structure seemed unremarkable from the outside, yet the living room was vast, the space expanding like a surreal dream. The furniture here was well maintained, antique, but without the neglect I'd seen elsewhere. Shelves along the walls were filled with the display cases, and behind the glass sat fabric dolls. They varied in size, some large, others small, some with smiles, others with grim or neutral expressions. Their eyes, embroidered or painted with meticulous detail, seemed to follow my every move. The dolls looked so lifelike that I momentarily thought whoever made them had mastered their craft to an extraordinary level. But that only made it worse. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Among this strange world of inert eyes, my thoughts began slipping into unsettling corners of my mind. The girl perched on the sofa in the center of the room, bent over something on the coffee table. I couldn't make out what it was, and something about her swift yet almost mechanical movements triggered my unease. I glanced toward the dining table in front of her, which stood like a stage in this bizarre theatrical setting. Seated at the table was a pair, a young man and woman. Their postures were perfect, backs turned to me, sitting motionless, not even glancing at the sound of my footsteps. Their stillness sent a wave of discomfort through me, but I tried to dismiss it as mere tension and nerves. A fleeting sense of relief washed over me. For a moment I thought I wasn't alone after all. At least there were other people here. Finally, I could deliver the pizza, apologize for intruding, and maybe even get a tip. But just as I tried to say something, the girl sharply shushed me, silencing me completely. Her gaze, once playful and full of life, now appeared cold and commanding. She beckoned me to sit next to her on the couch. My heart skipped a beat, uncertainty seeping through me, yet I couldn't refuse. Something about this place was deeply wrong, though there was no obvious reason for alarm. Still, a creeping sense of impending horror grew with each second of silence. I could feel that things were going terribly wrong. Two opposing forces wrestled within me. Logic, telling me it was best to leave, and an inexplicable fear that compelled me to obey this strange girl. Her parents, they didn't react to me or to her unceremonious pull to drag me into the apartment. They sat silently at the table, eating as if I were invisible. Their indifference scared me more than the girl herself. I sat down beside her, despite every instinct screaming against it. At first, nothing seemed amiss. A regular coffee table, a typical child's game. But as I looked closer at the details, I froze. On the table before us was a miniature dining set, complete with tiny dishes. And seated at it were 2 dolls. These dolls were exact replicas of her parents. Precise copies. My gaze stopped at the doll faces, the hairstyles, clothing, even the small, peculiar scars that matched perfectly with those I'd seen on the people at the table. Every detail was identical. This couldn't be a coincidence. Horror washed over me. My heart pounded like a trapped animal. Instinctively, I began to rise, desperate to get out of there. But as I moved, the girl suddenly grabbed my hand. There was too much strength in her small fingers. I felt her grip clamp down on my wrist like a vice. This was no ordinary child's touch. I froze, stunned by the unexpected strength. Her touch was unbearably cold, almost icy. Her fingers dug into my arm, but it didn't feel like a child's grip. Too strong, too unnatural. The skin on her hand was so hard and smooth that I could swear it was porcelain stretched under a thin layer of flesh. A sickening sensation overtook me as I traced my gaze along her arm and noticed strange joints protruding from beneath her skin, as if it were held together by something that didn't belong to a living being. My heart raced faster, and unable to tear my eyes away, I looked at her face. It no longer resembled anything human. Smooth, pale, almost gleaming. It displayed no emotion, not a trace of life. But it was her eyes that terrified me most. They no longer appeared human. They stared unblinking, cold, with a dull, glassy sheen in their depths. They were empty, like a doll's, devoid of any spark of life. Panic seized me. When I tried to pull free, her fingers tightened further, like iron claws embedded into my skin. I noticed her artificial joints under the skin twitching unevenly, as though a mechanism was struggling to function. I froze, and she firmly gestured for me to sit back down. Her command was as cold as an adult accustomed to being obeyed. I obediently sat. I felt that perhaps by sitting, I'd bought myself a momentary reprieve. And suddenly she smiled again, as if nothing had happened, as if all her anger had evaporated. She playfully continued, saying that our first date was drawing to a close, and that I simply had to watch what would happen next. Her words made my blood run cold. What date? I didn't understand what she meant, but before I could respond, she quickly picked up the dolls. Straightening them, she began to play, carefully manipulating them, her childish voice filling the room with dialogue and remarks for her characters. I felt a chilling dread at how delicately she handled the dolls. And then it happened. The pair at the dining table, who had been sitting as if paralyzed, suddenly rose slowly. It looked as if their bodies no longer obeyed them. At first, I thought they were just playing along with the girl, perhaps joking. But then I looked into their eyes and realized that the man and woman were utterly terrified, brimming with a dark despair. They began to mimic every move, every gesture of her dolls. I understood that this was no mere game. They moved in sync with her dolls, as if an invisible string pulled them by their limbs, forcing them to comply. I sat frozen in my chair, barely breathing. The girl continued to play, and I watched as her parents, or whoever they were, lifelessly reenacted the scene. At first it was innocent. They held hands, exchanged imaginary words, but then the girl began to enact a scene of a first kiss. The dolls drew closer to one another, their faces nearly touching, and the humans mirrored the movement in perfect synchrony. I sat frozen, dreading what would happen next. But even in my worst nightmares, I couldn't have anticipated what I was about to witness. When the dolls touched foreheads, the couple did the same, but instead of a gentle touch or kiss, their heads collided forcefully. Once, twice. The girl continued to play with the dolls, pressing their faces together with sudden intensity. The couple's heads knocked together repeatedly like mechanical toys. At first it looked like a child's game, but each new impact grew stronger, creating a sickening hollow sound that seemed to echo in my stomach. Their bodies, like marionettes, continued this action until the first drops of blood appeared on their foreheads. Seeing the couple slam their heads together with that awful dull thud, blood trickling down their faces, I realized this was no game. Panic seized my mind, and fear pierced through my body like an icy spike. My heart pounded wildly and my hands began to tremble. I pushed myself off the couch, trying to rise, but the girl's grip on my arm tightened. Her hold was almost inhuman, rigid, dry, and utterly unnatural for a child. She was murmuring something about the end of the show, but her voice sounded like a whisper from dreams that promised nightmares. An unbearable ringing filled my head, and I tore my hand from her grasp, lunging toward the door in blind panic. My legs felt weak, my body barely obeyed me, but every instinct screamed one command: flee. The apartment door slammed shut before me, as if obeying some invisible force, and the echo of it filled the corridor, making me flinch. The air thickened around me like a dark veil, and behind me, I heard the soft yet sinister laughter of the girl. It chilled me to the bone. It felt not like just a sound, but something alive watching me. I reached for the doorknob, but it seemed to come alive, slipping from my fingers like a wet fish. My hands shook as I tried again and again to grasp it, until finally I heard the creak. The door slowly opened with a prolonged, ominous sound, and I practically fell into the corridor, as if escaping a trap. But the moment I was outside, things only worsened. Darkness enveloped the building again, swallowing all light, and the corridor filled with thick, stifling air. I stood in the depths of shadow, trying to get my bearings, but there in the pitch blackness I heard footsteps, soft, quick, as though the girl was pursuing me. The hair on my neck stood up. It felt like someone was approaching. Terror and panic gripped me once more. I couldn't see a thing, but I sensed a presence, as if something was breathing down my neck. I sprinted toward the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, breaths coming in gasps, my legs nearly giving out. Each sound echoed in the darkness, reverberating off the walls. Finally, when I reached the stairs, something made me pause. Whispers began to emerge from the darkness. They were everywhere. It seemed as though every apartment around me had come to life. Voices began whispering my name. Running out of the first apartment, I found myself in the dark corridor. My heart still thumped so loudly it felt like its beats echoed through the walls. Panic flooded my mind, and each breath felt like a gulp of scorching smoke. I dashed down the steep stairs, not looking back, not caring about direction. Just down, away from that sinister place. Suddenly, I collided with a door. It stopped me abruptly, pressing against my shoulder, and I almost stumbled. I frantically tugged at it and with relief felt it give. The door slowly creaked open, and I burst inside, desperate to escape whatever was chasing me. The apartment greeted me with an unexpected coziness. A soft lamplight filled the room, a pot bubbled on the stove, and somewhere a television hummed quietly. The sensation of wrongness receded for a brief moment. I took a few steps forward, holding my breath. Something was off. The apartment's residents stood frozen in their places. A woman by the stove in the kitchen, a man in an armchair reading a newspaper, a child on the floor near the television holding a toy. They didn't move, made no sound. They were caught in their daily routines, frozen in time. I took another step, and a chill ran through me. They were motionless. Their postures were unnaturally tense, backs held too straight, hands frozen in an awkward stillness. Something about the silence and stillness was unbearably unnerving. I approached the woman by the stove, searching for any sign of life, a breath, a blink. She was breathing very slowly, but it was clear that even this took effort. Her chest rose barely perceptibly, and her gaze was empty, with frozen tears glistening in her unmoving eyes. Horror washed over me. Were they still human, or had they become marionettes? Figures trapped in time, unable to move on their own because no one was pulling their strings. I turned and froze when I saw a small table in the corner of the room. It held dolls, similar to those I'd seen in the previous apartment. Among them were figures resembling these frozen inhabitants. A doll in a cook's apron, a small boy with toys, a man in an armchair with a newspaper. They were exact replicas of the motionless people around me. Silent, they awaited hands to animate them, just like the lifeless bodies surrounding me. Panic wrapped around me like a thick fog. My body felt paralyzed, as though I'd become a puppet myself. I knew I needed to escape, but fear held me in place. Gathering the last remnants of my strength, I lunged toward the door, gripping the handle. But it wouldn't budge. I yanked at it with all my might, but it remained firmly shut, as if held by an invisible force. The frozen inhabitants sat on the couch, and like dolls seemed to wait for their master. I felt their gaze upon me, though they didn't move. Who controlled them? Who played these terrifying games with people? I backed away just as the woman twitched. Fear surged through me so intensely that my legs nearly gave way, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed everyone around could hear it. I barely kept my balance, bumping into a chair, and though my mind screamed to flee, something urged me to stop. My gaze was drawn to the same dolls on the shelf. They sat motionless, their hollow eyes staring at me, as if they knew something I couldn't understand. Something compelled me to reach out and pick up one of the dolls. It was cold in my hands, a bone-chilling cold, as if I were touching something that shouldn't exist. Terror gripped me down to my core. This wasn't just a doll. I felt as though something dark and sinister was inside it, waiting for the right moment to emerge. My hands trembled, and the cold seeped through my fingers. Unable to hold it any longer, I dropped the doll, and it hit the floor with a hollow thud that echoed in my head like a bell. But before I could gather my thoughts, I heard another sound, a loud, harsh noise, as though something heavy had fallen behind me. I spun around and my heart stopped. The woman who had been standing by the stove was now lying on the floor in the same position as the doll I dropped. She had fallen just like it. Her eyes remained wide, filled with horror, yet her body was frozen, immobile, like a wax figure. Fear choked me, made it hard to breathe. At that moment, a child's voice echoed from the corridor, a familiar voice, the girl from the previous apartment. But now it sounded different. There was something sinister, dissatisfied in her tone, as though her favorite game had been ruined. My heart pounded wildly in my chest as I heard her voice and the quickening footsteps drawing closer. Panic gripped me so tightly I could barely stand. I dashed toward the door, the same one I'd entered through. The handle was cold beneath my trembling fingers, but the door wouldn't budge, held shut by some invisible force. I twisted the handle again and again, each time harder, but nothing happened. The footsteps grew closer and time seemed to stretch in a horrifying slowness. Each sound thundered in my ears, each heartbeat counting down to an inevitable end. Summoning the last of my strength, I looked around, searching for another way out, and finally noticed a door at the far end of the room. I didn't think twice. I ran to it, desperate to escape this trap. The door opened and I found myself in a child's room. My eyes immediately fell on a small bed. A young boy lay there, no older than 6 or 7, wrapped in blankets. He looked defenseless, as if he were merely sleeping. But as I approached, his eyes suddenly opened. Bright blue eyes stared directly at me. In that moment, a sharp pain pierced me, a lump forming in my throat. There was something in that gaze, unspeakable sadness and fear. My body froze, overwhelmed by the thought of a child being trapped in such a horrifying place. The boy's gaze was so piercing it felt as if he were looking straight through me. There was a silent plea, a despairing call for rescue in his eyes. Compelled by an inner impulse, I knelt beside the bed, brushing my fingers over his cold cheek. An unbearable ache grew within me. I wanted to save him, to shield him from this nightmare. Feeling my throat tighten, I swallowed, trying to suppress the fear. But at that very moment, when it seemed that hope might still exist, loud footsteps echoed from the corridor. Thuds. Heavy, resounding blows like the steps of something massive, something terrifying. They were approaching. Fear wrapped around me with renewed force. My mind screamed to flee, but my body remained frozen. I glanced at the boy, then quickly hid in a wardrobe in the corner of the room. The tight space enveloped me, and I held my breath. The footsteps grew closer, and suddenly fell silent. Curled up inside the wardrobe, my heart pounded wildly, each beat pulsing through my temples. The darkness around me was so dense that I could barely see my own hands. It seemed that everything was over, that perhaps whoever was walking had left. But my instincts refused to believe it. The silence in the air felt unnaturally tense, like the calm before a storm. This stillness was shattered by the creak of the wardrobe doors. A chill of terror shot through me. Strong, calloused hands gripped my shoulders. I didn't even have time to resist as I was yanked out of the wardrobe with brutal force. My eyes met the wrinkled face of an old man. He looked ordinary, even disheveled, but his hands were like iron clamps. I tried to break free, but he pulled me out with such strength that my legs buckled, causing both of us to tumble onto the floor. A loud thud. His head hit the ground, and he began to scream. The piercing sound tore through the air like a siren. Panic overtook me once again. While he writhed on the floor, I managed to break free of his grip, scrambled to my feet, and dashed toward the door with all my might. One thought echoed in my mind: escape. Escape at any cost. Each step echoed in the empty corridor. I could hear my breath, mingled with the old man's screams fading behind me. My body burned with fear, every nerve stretched to the limit. I reached the door, grabbed the handle. The door swung open and I dashed into the corridor. Then suddenly a chime. I froze. The elevator doors opened before me with a soft hum. This was my chance. Without hesitation, I jumped inside, and the doors instantly closed. The elevator began descending, and I, breathing heavily, tried to make sense of what had just happened. My hands trembled, cold sweat trickling down my forehead. A feeling of relief slowly settled over me as the adrenaline began to subside. Maybe it was over. But then the chime sounded again. Only this time it was different. In an instant, everything plunged into darkness. The elevator stopped and the lights went out so quickly I couldn't comprehend what was happening. The silence was oppressive. Only my own breath disturbed the suffocating quiet. I rushed to the doors, trying to pry them open, but they wouldn't budge. The doors were stuck. They wouldn't open, not even a fraction. The elevator stood still, as if suspended in some void, and I was trapped here in darkness, completely sealed in. A new kind of fear engulfed me, a thick cloying dread that wrapped around me like tar, smothering me from head to toe. In the darkness, everything became uncertain. It felt as if reality itself was unraveling. My fingers clenched desperately against the walls, searching for any hold, but they were treacherously cold and slick, like metal covered in sweat or something worse. Breathing grew harder, and the cramped space felt as though invisible hands were squeezing me. Fear clouded my mind, leaving no room for rational thought. I was utterly, completely trapped. At first, I heard a faint rustling, a barely noticeable sound. It felt like something was slithering along the floor. I tried to orient myself in the darkness, but could not even see my own hands. The rustling slowly drew closer, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My breathing quickened, and fear intensified with each passing second. Suddenly, I felt something cold and slimy on my leg, like dead flesh. I jerked my leg, but the thing coiled around my ankles, refusing to let go. Panic froze me in place. I began thrashing wildly, trying to break free from whatever had latched onto my legs. It felt disgusting, as though thousands of tiny tentacles were crawling over me. In the darkness, the movement grew stronger. I heard groans, labored breaths, and felt it slowly creeping up my body. My fingers clawed desperately at the elevator walls, seeking any crack, but it was useless. Suddenly, I felt something tightening around my chest, like a rope, squeezing harder and harder. The air grew thick and heavy. I was suffocating, my heart pounding like mad. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The fear became almost physical. It choked me, paralyzing me. A single thought echoed in my mind. This was where my fate awaited me. And at that moment, when I felt I could bear no more, the elevator doors burst open with a loud clang. Light struck my eyes painfully, and I instinctively shielded them with my hand. Freed from that terrible grip, I stumbled forward, barely able to keep my balance. Something still clung to me, as if reluctant to release its hold, but with one final burst of energy, I tore myself free and stumbled ahead. I ran out of the elevator, barely staying on my feet, my heart ready to burst from terror. The skin on my legs was scraped raw, burning with pain, as if something had truly grabbed hold of me, trying to restrain me. But I had escaped, although that scream of horror that echoed in my mind left me trembling. Ahead I could see the exit doors. They seemed to be my last hope of salvation. I could see them. They were so close, just a few steps, and I would be free. Relief flooded my body, but I could barely hobble forward, dragging my legs with each painful step. Pain pulsed through the wounds, and every movement was agony. But I kept going, trying to move as quickly as possible. I was almost at the door, my hand reaching for the handle. Just a few more steps, but suddenly something struck me hard on the head. A sharp electric pain shot through my skull, and I nearly lost my balance. The world around me began to blur, pulling me toward a dark abyss. The doors so close dissolved into hazy shadows on the edge of my consciousness. The cold tiles of the corridor met my cheek, their icy touch the last sensation piercing through the fog in my mind. Everything faded as darkness slowly enveloped me, pulling me into its endless realm. It was the last thing I felt before everything disappeared into absolute blackness. When I awoke, I had no idea where I was. My eyes burned from the harsh light shining directly into my face. It was so bright that I could barely make out any details around me. For a few seconds, I just lay there, trying to make sense of what was happening. My heart was still racing, my body felt heavy, and the only thing I could feel was the lingering fear creeping into me like poison. Gradually, my eyes adjusted to the light, and the room slowly took shape before me. It looked nothing like I had expected. It resembled a dressing room. Along the walls were shelves filled with clothes, vibrant and varied, as though collected from different eras and styles. Dresses from centuries past hung beside modern suits, all sizes and colors mixed together. A chill ran through me at the thought that none of these things were here by chance. They felt like props for a show. But what kind of show? Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a vanity, a massive antique piece carved from dark wood, adorned with intricate patterns reminiscent of something very old, almost forgotten. It looked as though it belonged to the one who ruled over this room. Cosmetics lay scattered across the vanity, evidence that someone was constantly preparing for a performance. And the mirror. It was enormous, as if it absorbed every reflection, every movement, every shadow. My gaze lingered on it, and I felt as though it was breathing. The reflections in the mirror were distorted, with shadows dancing around me like puppets controlled by some unseen hand. Then I turned my head and saw a shelf filled with fabric. There were countless pieces, different textures, colors, their ends hanging down, forming intricate patterns that looked like webs. Beside the shelf stood an old sewing machine, a silent witness to whatever horrors had taken place here. It seemed this machine had seen more than I could ever imagine. Its needle may have stitched together not only fabric but human fates, intertwining lives into something distorted and terrifying. Finally, I understood what this place was. I had stumbled into the lair of the one who orchestrated all of this. The puppet master. The one who pulled the strings, controlled my every step, every breath, every fear that gripped me. The door creaked softly and I froze. Heavy, oppressive silence struck me. It seemed to thicken with each passing second, while my heart pounded in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head and saw her, the girl standing at the doorway. But she was no longer the same child I had seen before. Her clothing had changed. A grand, heavy dress, too lavish for this grim room, fell to the floor, blending seamlessly with the shadows. Yet it wasn't just the dress that drew my attention. There was something horribly wrong with her movements. When she stepped into the room, I noticed how her legs moved unnaturally. Her walk resembled the stilted motions of a puppet on strings, rigid and uncertain. Yet she continued forward, as if performing a silent dance. Her arms were held at odd angles, unmoving, and her fingers were so straight and stiff they looked incapable of bending. Her entire form, mechanical, unnatural, like a doll that had just stepped off the shelf. Then I met her gaze. The same cold, vacant expression that had once seemed merely indifferent now contained something even more unsettling. Her eyes gleamed in the light, but not like a human's. The shine was glassy, lifeless. The reflection of light on them was so sharp and cold that it made breathing difficult. There was something deeply wrong hiding behind her still pupils, something that didn't belong in this world. Her gaze didn't just look at me, it pierced through me, as if this doll-like shell concealed something far more terrifying. I felt trapped in an invisible snare, unable to move, while every cell in my body screamed of danger. This horrifying mechanism in the shape of a girl seemed more dreadful than any creature I had ever encountered. This was something unnatural, horrific, and yet I still couldn't understand what kind of entity stood before me. It was as if her body was merely a shell for something far more malevolent. Tension rose in my chest with each passing second. Breathing became harder, and my skin tingled with an indescribable fear. My hands were bound to the chair, the straps around my wrists so tight I could barely move. Panic began to overwhelm me. A single thought pulsed in my mind. This was no game. I was trapped. The girl slowly advanced, her dress whispering against the floor, and each step echoed like a dull thud in my mind. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help me escape. I felt the straps straining as I struggled to free myself, but it was hopeless. Then I noticed a gleam on the table beside me. Scissors. They lay just a few centimeters away. The girl stopped beside me and began speaking softly. Her voice was sweet, almost gentle, yet I could sense a hidden menace within it. She spoke of how soon everything would be fine, that this was only a part of her plan, a part of her show. She assured me I would make a wonderful new member of their dollhouse. Her words sounded like a mad whisper, as if she had already envisioned everything down to the smallest detail. She cryptically hinted that they would love the new character, and that the new performance was almost ready. A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shut her out, but each word pierced through me like needles. She spoke about me as though I were not a person, but a piece of her strange performance, a fragment of this incomprehensible, eerie reality she had crafted. Her words seeped into my mind, slowly trying to imprison me in this horrifying nightmare. But my gaze remained locked on the scissors. I gathered all my strength, slowly and quietly shifting my hands, praying she wouldn't notice. A sense of urgency overwhelmed me. Whatever horror approached, it was imminent. Something beyond comprehension, but palpable in every nerve. In a single moment, my fingers grasped the cold, sharp metal, the only tool I had to defend myself. But before I could look up, the girl lunged at me. The attack was unexpected, startlingly swift and powerful, completely incongruous with her small frame. Tiny, almost delicate, she struck me with a fury like a wild animal, throwing me back. I felt my ribs crack with a sickening crunch. My mind refused to believe what was happening. Her thin arms clamped around my shoulders like iron, her face twisted into an absurd mask of rage. And I felt another fracture somewhere within, but shock dulled the pain. Her eyes burned with a cold fire. There was no time to think. My body acted instinctively. I twisted my broken arm free of the ropes and grabbed the scissors. The metal glinted in the dim light as I swung with all my might at the puppeteer. The blade sliced through her skin with a grating ceramic sound, as if scraping across a plate beneath her flesh. She didn't scream, didn't retreat. She merely glared at me with eyes filled with unbridled hatred. I slashed again, grazing her cheek. For a moment I expected blood, but suddenly the skin on her face began to crack, like thin paint on porcelain. The gash left by the scissors transformed into a web of fine fractures spreading across her cheek, exposing a gleaming white surface beneath. Instead of pain or fear, her eyes held only cold determination, as if the wound hadn't affected her at all. She continued to strike me relentlessly. Then I understood. This wasn't a person. It couldn't be a person. Standing before me was a doll with a porcelain face cracking from my blows. She was the one controlling everyone in this house, the ruler of this nightmare realm. Panic surged anew. She just stared at me, her empty glassy eyes mocking my helplessness. The wounded doll froze, clutching her shoulder where I'd left a deep cut. Her expression shifted to a strange calm, almost satisfaction, but I could bear no more. Stopping now was deadly. I had to act. Taking advantage of her hesitation, I tore free from the chair. The corridor beyond the door stretched endlessly, its dark walls closing in on me, as if the space itself shrank with each step I took. The air was thick, heavy, nearly suffocating. The light bulbs above flickered, casting brief dim flashes that turned the hallway into a labyrinth. I ran without thinking of direction, just moving forward, desperate to escape this dollhouse of horrors. Then behind me I heard heavy footsteps, one after another, each sound making my heart clench with terror. I turned around. The old man, the same man who had dragged me from the closet, was now rushing after me. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes glinting with feverish determination, and he moved faster than I thought possible. Every step of his sounded like a hammer blow against the concrete floor, and it seemed as though the very walls shook with each impact. The corridor wavered, shrinking and expanding, as if trying to trap me within its walls. My body shook with tension and fear, but I couldn't stop. The old man was closing in, and I could hear his labored breathing behind me. The corridor narrowed and cold sweat trickled down my spine. Suddenly he appeared in front of me. He emerged from the shadows as if materializing from the darkness itself. His eyes burned with a crazed fury, and he lunged at me like a wild beast. There was almost no room to maneuver. The narrow hallway locked us in, leaving me nowhere to run. We collided, and I felt his bony fingers dig into my shirt. His strength was astonishing. He pinned me to the wall with such force that the air rushed out of my lungs, and my vision blurred. I struggled to break free, but the old man was unbelievably strong. His face drew close to mine, and I heard his fevered whisper, the words incomprehensible, but their intent unmistakably lethal. Desperately raising the scissors, I blindly struck. I felt the blade sink into the old man's body, and he let go, clutching the wound in agony. I saw his face twist in pain as he began to collapse to the floor like a broken puppet. I don't know what was worse in that moment, seeing the same porcelain beneath his skin, or the possibility that he was a real human doing this of his own free will. That brief advantage was all I needed. Shaking with adrenaline, I broke free and left him behind, his weak groans echoing in the corridor. But there was no time. The walls seemed ready to close in around me. The building itself shook even harder, as if it were wrapped in its own nightmare. Plaster crumbled from cracks, and the floor gave way beneath my feet. I stumbled forward, my legs struggling to keep me moving, as if the entire building were trying to hold me back. I heard it groan and creak, like a living organism feeding off my fear. And there, up ahead, light flickered. The entrance doors. They were so close, just a few steps away, but each step felt like an eternity. My heart pounded furiously, and my body was on the verge of giving up. Limping, I drew closer to the doors, relief beginning to flood my veins. But with every step, my legs grew heavier. I lunged for the doors, hoping this was my one chance at escape. My fingers trembled as they gripped the old brass handle. For a moment, it felt as though the doors wouldn't budge, as if an unseen force was determined to keep me locked in this cursed place. But suddenly the lock clicked, and with a creak, the doors swung open. Fresh air. I staggered outside, nearly collapsing onto the pavement. Bright sunlight seared my eyes, forcing them shut after so long in darkness. My legs gave way, and I fell to my knees, feeling the cold ground beneath me, a welcome touch against my battered body. I lay there, arms outstretched, bleeding from my broken bones, as if trying to embrace the pavement. The only thing that felt real after the nightmare I had endured. My heart still raced, and my lungs greedily gulped the air. Rain began to patter against the granite, washing away my blood. Relief mixed with something else, an unbearable, lingering fear. I had escaped, but I still couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. I looked up at the sky, seeking an answer, but all I saw was a pale blue expanse and a sun that now seemed indifferent to my horror. The euphoria was short-lived. Suddenly, pain shot through my body, twisting every muscle. Breathing became difficult. My lungs burned as if a fire had ignited inside. I lay on the pavement, broken and exhausted, staring up at the blinding sun. It was too bright, almost mocking, highlighting the stark contrast between the outside world and the one I had just escaped. My head throbbed, and memories danced chaotically. The room, the girl, the dollhouse, the old man. All these images crashed into my consciousness, yet they felt detached from reality. I took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together, though my grip on reality felt tenuous. And then a sudden memory surfaced, breaking through the fog. The boy. I had promised to save him. I remembered his terrified, desperate gaze. He was still there, trapped in that house with those creatures. The thought sent a wave of cold sweat down my back. I had to act. The police, reporting this horror, was the only way to end it. I had to tell them everything that happened. Otherwise, I'd never forgive myself. My body protested with every move, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to my feet, leaning on the nearest wall. My mind locked onto a single thought: save him. I felt the urgency in every beat of my heart. Every minute counted. The police and ambulance arrived quickly. 2 cars with flashing lights but no sirens. They assumed it was a minor incident. My hands trembled. My breathing was labored. The memories of what happened wouldn't leave me. The officers tried to calm me, thinking I had just been mugged or assaulted, a common occurrence in this part of town. But I knew what I had experienced was real. At first glance, the building looked perfectly ordinary. Yet with each step toward the door, my heart pounded harder. I knocked, struggling to steady my shaking hands. Anxiety and fear surged, and as I knocked again, harder this time, I found myself desperately hoping someone would answer quickly. The door slowly opened, and a small elderly woman appeared in the doorway. Her wrinkled face radiated such warmth and kindness that I involuntarily held my breath. For a moment, it seemed like it had all been a hallucination. How could such a friendly, gentle woman be connected to the horror I'd experienced? I glanced at the officers. They exchanged looks, and I saw doubt in their eyes. They didn't believe me. The police began asking a few standard questions, but I heard the skepticism in their voices, sensed that my story sounded like madness to them. The elderly woman answered calmly, kindly, explaining that the house was always quiet, that no one suspicious had ever come by. Her voice was so peaceful, so ordinary, that I found myself questioning my own memories. Had I really confused something? But my heart pounded. I clearly remembered seeing that girl, remembered the terrible wrongness. I tried to explain it to the officers, to tell them what had happened, but they looked at me as though I were insane. Their gazes, full of suspicion and disbelief, burned into me. They no longer believed me, and I knew it. I stood outside the house, my feet seemingly rooted to the ground. A cold wind lifted dust from the road, brushing against my face but bringing no relief. My thoughts were scattered, like the dry leaves swirling around me. The trembling in my body wouldn't stop. I felt broken, exhausted, as though I had endured something unimaginable. Yet with each passing minute, my mind suggested it could all have been a trick of my vulnerable imagination. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but the oppressive feeling wouldn't let go. Something was wrong, and the more I tried to dismiss it, the stronger it haunted me. I looked back at the house, hoping to find some evidence to validate what had happened, but everything looked normal. I moved closer to the windows. A thick layer of grime covered them, making it nearly impossible to see inside. No movement, no sign of life. All those events from just minutes ago now felt like a distant nightmare. Maybe I had lost control of myself, but I remembered every detail. The girl, that eerie house, their distorted faces. It was all too real to be a mere figment of my imagination. Then I looked again at the old woman standing in the doorway, and I frowned. Something seemed different about her. Her gaze was fixed on me, and there was something in that look that made my fists clench. I wanted to turn away, to leave, but I couldn't. Her face seemed calm, but there was a barely noticeable change in her expression. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, and my heart froze. On her cheek, I noticed a thin, almost imperceptible scar with a web of cracks spreading from it. A faint line precisely where I had slashed the girl's cheek with the scissors. I remembered the blade scraping the porcelain underneath, and now that scar was on the old woman's face. My legs felt weak, and I could barely keep my balance. How was this possible? This was a different person, a different situation. But the scar, it was the same. And suddenly her smile, which had initially seemed ordinary, began to change. Her lips slowly stretched, revealing yellowed teeth. The smile grew wider and wider, and her eyes, once warm, gradually turned cold, as if freezing over. Her gaze was no longer human. It held a darker intent, something deeply sinister. I felt my heart stop for a moment. Her smile was no longer that of a grandmother. It was a mask hiding something inhuman. And in that moment I understood. Everything I had experienced was real. The old woman continued to stare at me, her smile growing wider, as if she knew something I didn't understand. Her eyes gleamed, not with human warmth, but with a cold, sinister wisdom. I felt every muscle tense, as though my body sensed something before my mind did. Suddenly she spoke. Her voice was low, but each word sank deep into my soul. "He is mine, and you will never be able to save him." Those words hung in the air, and I felt my world begin to crumble. Everything around me seemed frozen in time, the only movement being the slow, deliberate way the old woman closed the door before me. I stood there, unmoving, watching as she faded into the shadows of the house. The door closed slowly, creaking, the sound resonating inside me, echoing in my mind. My heart thundered in my chest, but I couldn't make myself move. Her words echoed within me. "You will never be able to save him." It felt as if the ground was splitting open beneath me, and I was falling into a bottomless abyss. I couldn't comprehend how it had come to this. That boy was still in there. I had seen him, tried to help, but now I understood. This was a trap from which there was no escape. I would never be able to save him. The door shut completely. The entire house seemed dead to me. It was as if it had never breathed, never truly existed, and I was left standing here, in the center of something terrifying that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I remained on the sidewalk, surrounded by a silence that weighed heavier than any noise. My heart clenched with terror, and I felt waves of dread crashing over me like a relentless tide. My mind refused to accept what had happened, but my body knew. It was real. Helplessness and despair closed in from every side, and I understood that it would never release me. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.